The people who ordinarily wouldn't get involved in politics, who just want to live their lives. They don't want they're quiet. They just go about their business. My message is to them: if this continues, that violence is going to come to you. You will have no choice.
When Silicon Valley meets Whitehall, Musk's explosive London intervention. Right. Before we dive into what might be the most politically charged weekend London has witnessed in recent memory, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell because UK Connors is about to dissect a story that has Westminster absolutely seething and Silicon Valley billionaires playing puppet master with British democracy. Saturday, the 14th of September, will go down as a day Elon Musk decided to tell Britain how to run its affairs, and frankly, the fallout has been nothing short of spectacular. Picture this. The world's most powerful tech mogul, beaming in via video link to address upwards of 150,000 protesters in central London, essentially calling for the dissolution of our democratically elected parliament. The audacity is breathtaking, the implications staggering, and the political response? Well, let's just say Downing Street isn't sending us a Christmas card anytime soon. The scene was set at what organizers called the Unite the Kingdom March, a demonstration that saw between 110,000 and 150,000 people flooding London streets. But this wasn't your garden variety political rally. This was Tommy Robinson's stage, and Musk chose to be his headline act from across the Atlantic. The man who owns X, who controls a digital town square where political discourse lives and dies, decided to use his platform not just to comment on British politics, but to actively intervene in it with language so inflammatory that even seasoned political observers are struggling to find precedent. And if you're thinking this story can't get more explosive, stick around because we're just getting started. Make sure you're subscribed because this is a kind of analysis that cuts through the Westminster bubble nonsense and gives you the unvarnished truth about power, influence, and the very real threat to British democratic norms we witnessed this weekend. Either fight back or you die. Those weren't the words of a desperate revolutionary hiding in the shadows. Those were the words of Elon Musk, speaking directly to tens of thousands of protesters in the heart of London. Let that sink in for a moment. The owner of one of the world's most influential social media platforms, a man whose single tweet can move markets and topple governments, chose to use language that any reasonable observer would classify as incendiary at best, seditious at worst. But Musk wasn't finished there. Oh no, he was just warming up. The tech billionaire then proceeded to call for nothing less than the dissolution of Parliament and a change of government. Not through the ballot box, mind you, not through the democratic processes that have served this nation for centuries, but through the kind of direct action that his choice of words seemed to encourage. This isn't political commentary. This is a foreign billionaire attempting to destabilize a sovereign democracy, and he did it with the casual confidence of a man who believes his wealth insulates him from consequences. Peter Kyle, the business secretary, didn't mince words when he described Musk's intervention as totally inappropriate and slightly incomprehensible. But Kyle's diplomatic language barely scratches the surface of what we witnessed. This was unprecedented interference in British politics by a foreign actor, dressed up as free speech but functioning as something far more sinister. Labour sources were more direct, describing Musk's remarks as disgusting and calling on democratic politicians to distance themselves from such inflammatory rhetoric. But here's where it gets truly concerning, and why you need to subscribe to UK Connors for this kind of unflinching analysis. Musk's intervention wasn't happening in a vacuum. This was a calculated move by a man who has spent months positioning himself as a kingmaker in global politics, from his involvement in the American election cycle to his increasingly aggressive commentary on European affairs. What we witnessed in London was a weaponization of social media influence for direct political intervention, and it should terrify anyone who believes in democratic sovereignty. The Metropolitan Police had deployed over 1,000 officers to manage the demonstration and the counter-protest organized by Stand Up to Racism, which drew approximately 5,000 participants. They knew this wasn't going to be a peaceful afternoon in Hyde Park. They were preparing for trouble, and trouble is exactly what they got. By the end of the day, 25 people were in custody and 26 police officers had been injured, including 4 with serious wounds. This is the real-world consequence of inflammatory rhetoric meeting street politics, and Musk's words were the accelerant on an already volatile situation. The violence that erupted wasn't spontaneous. It was predictable, and that makes Musk's choice of language even more reckless. When you tell 150,000 people they must fight back or die, when you call for the dissolution of democratic institutions, you're not engaging in political debate. You're inciting civil unrest. The fact that this came from someone of Musk's influence and reach makes it exponentially more dangerous. And if you think this is just about one Saturday afternoon in London, you're missing the bigger picture entirely. Subscribe now, because UK Connors is going to connect the dots that mainstream media won't touch. Sir Keir Starmer's response was swift and uncompromising, though whether it was sufficient remains to be seen. The Prime Minister declared he would not stand for violence against police or people feeling intimidated on our streets. He positioned the Union Jack as a symbol that would never surrender to being co-opted as a symbol of violence, fear, and division. Strong words from Downing Street, but words that highlight just how serious the threat to public order had become. Starmer's statement on X, ironically, Musk's own platform, emphasized that while people have a right to peaceful protest, there would be zero tolerance for attacks on police officers or communities feeling threatened because of their background or skin color. It was a direct rebuke to the kind of rhetoric that had dominated Saturday's march, and a clear signal that the government recognized the existential threat such language poses to social cohesion. But here's the question that should keep every Democrat awake at night. What happens when the world's most influential social media platform is owned by someone willing to actively destabilize democratic governments? Musk didn't just observe Saturday's events. He orchestrated them. He didn't just comment on British politics. He attempted to direct it. And he did it all from the safety of his Silicon Valley bubble, insulated from the consequences of the violence his words helped unleash on London streets. This is about more than free speech or political commentary. This is about the fundamental question of democratic sovereignty in the digital age. When foreign billionaires can beam into domestic political movements and call for the overthrow of elected governments, we're not talking about robust political debate. We're talking about digital colonialism. And if you want to understand how this fits into the broader pattern of tech billionaire political intervention, make sure you're subscribed, because UK Connors is the only channel giving you this level of analysis. The Unite the Kingdom march itself deserves scrutiny beyond Musk's inflammatory contribution. Drawing up to 150,000 people to central London represents a significant mobilization of far-right sentiment, organized around Tommy Robinson's particular brand of nationalist politics. Robinson, who was transformed from an aircraft engineer apprentice to one of Britain's most prominent far-right activists, has built his movement on a foundation of anti-immigration rhetoric and cultural grievance politics. But Saturday's demonstration represented something new: the international amplification of British far-right politics through Silicon Valley's most powerful megaphone. Musk's intervention elevated what might have been a domestic political protest into something approaching an international incident. When the owner of X tells British citizens to overthrow their government, that's not political commentary. That's foreign interference on a scale we've never witnessed before. The counter-protest organized by Stand Up to Racism, drawing 5,000 participants, represents the other side of this equation. These were people who recognized the threat that Saturday's rhetoric posed to Britain's multicultural democracy and chose to stand against it. The fact that they were vastly outnumbered by the main demonstration should concern anyone who values social cohesion and democratic norms. The Metropolitan Police's deployment of over 1,000 officers wasn't an overreaction. It was a recognition of the tinderbox atmosphere that inflammatory rhetoric creates when it meets street politics. The 26 officers who were injured, including 4 seriously, paid the physical price for the verbal violence that Musk and others unleashed on London streets. These aren't abstract political consequences. These are real people suffering real harm because foreign billionaires want to play revolutionary politics with other people's safety. And here's where UK Connors differs from every other political channel. We're willing to call this what it is. This wasn't political discourse. It was digital terrorism. Musk used his platform to incite violence against democratic institutions and the people sworn to protect them. The fact that he did it from thousands of miles away doesn't make it less dangerous. It makes it more cowardly. Ed Davey, the Liberal Democrat leader, joined the chorus of condemnation, recognizing that Musk's intervention represented a fundamental threat to British democratic norms. But condemnation isn't enough when we're facing digital-age authoritarianism with analog-age responses. The tools that allowed Musk to project his influence into British politics operate at light speed. The democratic institutions trying to respond move at glacial pace. This asymmetry of influence is a defining political challenge of our time, and Saturday's events in London were just the latest example of how foreign actors with digital platforms can destabilize domestic democratic processes. Musk's intervention wasn't just inappropriate. It was a proof of concept for how tech billionaires can weaponize their platforms for direct political intervention in sovereign democracies. The Labour sources describing Musk's remarks as disgusting weren't engaging in political hyperbole. They were recognizing an existential threat to the democratic process. When foreign billionaires can call for the dissolution of elected parliaments and face no meaningful consequences, we're not talking about robust political debate. We're talking about the collapse of democratic sovereignty. But the most chilling aspect of Saturday's events wasn't the violence, shocking though it was. It wasn't even Musk's inflammatory rhetoric, dangerous though it proved to be. It was a demonstration of how easily democratic discourse can be hijacked by those with sufficient digital reach and zero democratic accountability. Musk didn't need to stand for election, didn't need to build a domestic political movement, didn't even need to set foot on British soil. He simply needed to own the right platform and be willing to use it without restraint. This is a new reality of democratic politics in the digital age, and if you want to understand how it's reshaping not just British politics but democratic governance worldwide, you need to subscribe to UK Connors. We're the only channel connecting these dots with the seriousness they deserve. The 25 arrests that followed Saturday's violence represent just the tip of the iceberg in terms of consequences. These are individuals whose lives will be permanently affected by their decision to answer Musk's call to fight back. They are facing criminal charges, potential imprisonment, and lifetime consequences because a Silicon Valley billionaire decided to play revolutionary politics with their futures. The moral bankruptcy of Musk's position is staggering. He incited the violence but bears none of the risk. This asymmetry of consequences perfectly encapsulates the digital age's fundamental democratic crisis. Those with platform can incite, those without them bear the costs. Those with influence can destabilize, those without it pay the price. Saturday's events in London were a perfect case study in how digital feudalism operates in practice. The broader implications extend far beyond British politics. If Musk can successfully intervene in British democratic processes without meaningful consequences, what's to stop him, or others like him, from doing the same elsewhere? We're witnessing the emergence of a new form of digital imperialism, where tech billionaires treat sovereign democracies as laboratories for their political experiments. Prime Minister Starmer's response, while necessary, highlighted the inadequacy of traditional democratic responses to digital age threats. Condemning inflammatory rhetoric after violence has erupted is closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. The challenge facing democratic governments worldwide is developing proactive responses to digital interference that don't compromise democratic values while still protecting democratic institutions. The scenes of violence between protesters and police that played out on London streets weren't spontaneous eruptions of political passion. They were the predictable result of inflammatory rhetoric meeting organized political grievance. Musk's contribution to this toxic mixture was a digital equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre, except the theatre was British democracy itself. What we witnessed on Saturday represents a fundamental shift in how foreign actors can interfere in domestic politics. Gone are the days when such interference required covert operations, diplomatic pressure, or economic leverage. Now all it takes is a social media platform and the willingness to use it without democratic restraint. Musk's intervention in British politics via video link to Tommy Robinson's march will be studied as a watershed moment in the evolution of digital authoritarianism. The fact that this intervention came through X, Musk's own platform, adds another layer of concern. This wasn't just foreign interference. It was foreign interference facilitated by infrastructure that presents itself as a neutral communication platform. The conflict of interest is so glaring it would be comedic if the consequences weren't so serious. Musk has essentially weaponized his own platform to destabilize democratic governments while maintaining the fiction that is simply providing a space for free expression. Subscribe to UK Connors because we're going to continue tracking how this digital feudalism evolves and what it means for democratic governance in the 21st century. The international reaction to Musk's intervention has been telling in its restraint. While British politicians condemned his remarks, international partners have remained largely silent. This silence is itself significant, representing either diplomatic calculation or failure to grasp the precedent that's been set. When foreign billionaires can call for the overthrow of democratically elected governments without triggering international diplomatic consequences, we've entered uncharted territory in terms of democratic sovereignty. The 150,000 people who attended Saturday's march didn't materialize from nowhere. They represent years of careful cultivation of grievance politics, amplified and accelerated by social media algorithms that reward engagement over accuracy, emotion over evidence. Musk's platform has been instrumental in this process, creating echo chambers where extreme rhetoric becomes normalized and democratic norms become optional. The power of responsible countermessaging. The 5,000 people who attended the Stand Up to Racism counter-protest demonstrated that not all of British society is susceptible to authoritarian appeals. They represent the antibodies in the democratic system, the people willing to stand up for multicultural democracy even when it's under sustained attack. The challenge facing British democracy isn't just Musk's intervention or even the rise of far-right politics. It's the broader erosion of shared factual foundations that make democratic discourse possible. When different parts of the population operate from fundamentally different sets of facts, democratic debate becomes impossible and political violence becomes inevitable. Saturday's events were a symptom of this deeper democratic crisis. The Metropolitan Police's handling of the situation deserves recognition alongside criticism. They managed to prevent the kind of catastrophic violence that could have erupted when 150,000 protesters encountered organized counter-protesters in central London. But the fact that 26 officers were injured in the process highlights the real-world cost of allowing inflammatory rhetoric to go unchallenged until it explodes into street violence. As we look ahead, Saturday's events represent either a wake-up call for democratic institutions or a preview of things to come. The choice isn't binary. It's about whether democratic societies can develop effective responses to digital age threats while preserving the open discourse that democracy requires. Musk's intervention in British politics has made this choice more urgent and the stakes more clear. The most troubling aspect of Saturday's events wasn't what happened, but what didn't happen. There were no meaningful consequences for Musk's inflammatory intervention, no diplomatic protest from the British government, no sanctions or restrictions on his platform's operations in the UK. The message sent was clear. Foreign billionaires can interfere in British democracy with impunity as long as they do it digitally. This precedent is now set, and other actors, both foreign governments and non-state actors, will be taking notes. If Musk can call for the dissolution of Parliament without consequences, what's to stop others from trying similar interventions? Saturday's events weren't just about British politics. They were a proof of concept for digital age authoritarianism worldwide. The 25 arrests that followed the violence represent just the beginning of the legal consequences for Saturday's events. These cases will work their way through the British legal system over the coming months, creating a paper trail that will help historians understand how democratic discourse collapsed into street violence. But the person most responsible for inciting that violence, Elon Musk, will face no legal consequences whatsoever. This asymmetry of accountability is a defining feature of digital age politics. Those with platforms can incite, those without them bear the consequences. Those with influence can destabilize, those without it pay the price. Saturday's events in London were a perfect illustration of how this dynamic operates in practice and why it represents an existential threat to democratic governance. The broader implications of Saturday's events extend far beyond British shores. If democratic governments cannot develop effective responses to foreign digital interference, then the concept of democratic sovereignty becomes meaningless. Saturday's events were a stress test of British democratic institutions, and the results were deeply concerning. Here's what makes UK Connors different from every other political channel. We're willing to say that Saturday's events represented a fundamental assault on British democratic norms that demands a response proportionate to the threat. Diplomatic protests and parliamentary condemnations aren't sufficient when facing digital age authoritarianism. The tools being used to attack democracy operate at 21st century speed. The responses need to match that urgency. Saturday, the 14th of September, 2024 will be remembered as a day foreign interference in British politics went mainstream. Elon Musk's intervention in domestic British political processes via video link to Tommy Robinson's march crossed every red line that should exist around democratic sovereignty. The violence that followed wasn't an accident. It was a predictable result of inflammatory rhetoric meeting organized political grievance, amplified by the world's most powerful social media platform. The 150,000 people who answered Musk's call to fight back or die weren't just attending a political rally. They were participating in a foreign billionaire's experiment in digital authoritarianism. The 26 police officers who were injured weren't just doing their jobs. They were paying the physical price for democratic society's failure to develop adequate responses to digital age threats. The 25 people who were arrested weren't just making poor individual choices. They were responding to incitement from someone who will never face consequences for his words. This is a new reality of politics in the digital age, where foreign actors with sufficient platform reach can destabilize domestic democratic processes without meaningful accountability. Saturday's events in London were just the beginning, not the end, of this particular threat to democratic governance. The question facing not just Britain but every democracy worldwide is whether they can develop responses adequate to the challenge before it's too late. If you want to understand how this story develops, how democratic institutions adapt to digital age threats, and what it means for the future of democratic governance, you need to subscribe to UK Connors. Hit that notification bell, because we're going to be tracking every development in this story as it unfolds. The mainstream media will move on to the next crisis, but UK Connors stays focused on the stories that matter for British democracy. Subscribe now, and let's continue this conversation about the future of democratic governance in the digital age.